Hello everybody, it's Haj here. This video is to clarify my answer to one of the comments that I received in my video, and I will also take then this opportunity to express my opinion about the newly announced Nikon Z8. In that comment, the author was asking me to compare the autofocus speed of the Z8 against the Z9, because he is suspecting that the small battery in the Z8 could potentially throttle the autofocus performance of the camera. And as I mentioned in my reply to that comment, I will not be able to afford owning the Z8 and the Z9, so I will not compare those two cameras side by side. I will just base my answer on my experience with the Z9, and of course then the tech specs of the Z8, and my general knowledge on Nikon's cameras. My short answer is, although we men tend to be obsessed about size is not everything. But joke aside, the small battery of the Z8 will not throttle the autofocus performance of the camera. The Z8 will be just as good as the Z9. That is my short answer, but if you want to know why I come up with such conclusion, then please bear with me and keep watching. Before the Z8 was announced, there was lots of speculations going on around, and there was an interesting group of skeptical people who had a strong opinion that those waiting for the Z8 will be disappointed because it will not be as good as the Z9. Their argument is that making the Z8 as good as the Z9 will kill the market share of the Z9. However, interesting enough, those same people also argue that Nikon will not be able to cut out those great features in the Nikon Z9 in order to make a new camera if they want to stay competitive in the market. So basically then it's kind of like, well, Nikon is kind of screwed. Like, they cannot make the camera like the Z9, but also they cannot produce a camera which is not as good as the Z9. Those people must have been shocked and confused once Nikon announced the Z8, because when we look at the specification of the Z8, and if we also watch those pre-review on the Z8 actually is exactly a Z9. It's just in a small format. It seems like Nikon prioritized the voice of its customers or potential customers rather than looking at the market share of the Z9. So now people are starting to look for something to nitpick, and it seems like the small battery in the Z8 caught someone's attention. And this skepticism is actually based on Nikon cameras history. It's not the first time that Nikon chopped off the vertical grip of a flagship camera to make a lighter new camera. They did it with the D700 by chopping off the vertical grip of the D3. And recently they did it also with the D850 and the D500, which were then based on the D5. And although the flagship camera and its siblings share actually the same hardware, the small factor camera always comes in a slower frame rate. The D3 is capable of 9 frames per second, while the D700 goes only up to 5 frames per second. Also, the D5 shoots at 12 frames per second, while the D500 is at 10 frames per second, and the D850 is at 7 frames per second. But one interesting characteristic that the D700 and the D850 share is that once you boost the camera with a high voltage, reminding me of that movie Crank by Jason Statham, the frame rates of the camera is increasing. The D700 is capable of shooting at 8 frames per second, and the D850 with a large battery in the battery grip is capable of 9 frames per second. But in addition to the increased frame rates, people also noticed an improvement in the autofocus of the camera once a bigger battery has been used. And I think that is the source of this skepticism on the autofocus performance of the Z8. But as I already tried to explain in my comment, the higher voltage or the bigger battery was never intended to improve the autofocus performance of the camera. The purpose of it was to give enough power to the camera to shoot at the higher frame rates. So where did it come from then, this improvement in autofocus performance? In my opinion, this increase in the autofocus performance of the D850 is actually nothing than a byproduct of the high frame rates. How good will the camera be if it is able to shoot at high frame rates but could not keep up tracking the subject? On the other hand, it might be a waste of a resource to make a camera capable of, let's say, tracking the subject at 20 frames per second, while actually the camera only take 5 pictures per second. Yes, now you get where I'm going. So let's take an example of the D5, D500, D850. All of those three cameras actually share the same processor, the X-Speed 5. They also share the same autofocus system with 193 focus points and 99 cross-type focus points. But what makes the D5 better than the D500 and the D850 is that the D5 actually shoot at 12 frames per second. It means that the D5 is actually capable of tracking the subject while taking pictures at 12 frames per second. The hardware in the D500, on the other hand, might have been then throttled down, if we can call it that way, to track the subject at 10 frames per second. The case of the D850 is interesting because it seems like it is then tracking the subject at 7 frames per second without the battery grip, and that limitation has been pushed up a little bit to 9 frames per second once we use the battery grip, and of course we see some improvement in the autofocus system. On the other hand, even if I use the battery grip on the D500, I don't feel any autofocus improvement, because yes, the D500 still keeps shooting at 10 frames per second, so basically it is still tracking the subject at 10 frames per second. And therefore the autofocus performance of the D5 is better than the D500, and the autofocus of the D500 is actually better than the D850. And just like the COVID vaccine, the performance of the D850 is better once it's been boosted with the battery grip. But back to the Z8, Z9. First of all, the Z8 and the Z9 are mirrorless cameras, and they do not have a mechanical shutter. So they don't need actually a high voltage battery in order to move the shutter faster. Even with its native small battery setting, the Z8 already shoot at 20 frames per second, just like the Z9 with the big battery grip. And if you are inclined to shoot a 11 megapixel, you can go up to 120 frames per second with the Z8 and also with the Z9. So in terms of frame rates, both cameras perform exactly the same way. So back to my reasoning with the DSLR camera. The Z9 is capable of focus tracking the subject up to 120 frames per second. And so is also the Z8. It is also capable of tracking a subject at up to 120 frames per second. While the D700 was called the baby D3, and the D850 and the D500 were called baby D5, I would say the Z8 is actually a little brother of the Z9. They are the same camera in terms of performance, but just in a different size factor. In my opinion, the small battery size in the Z8 could be even beneficial, because yes, it makes the camera lighter for those who want lighter camera. But in addition, with the optional battery grip, the Z8 can be equipped with a hot swappable battery. And that could come handy if you do, for example, a very long time lapse. So what important features did the Nikon cut out of the Z9 to make the Z8? I don't think they did much than chopping off the vertical grip of the Z9. The Z8 should be that good. If I would nitpick, I would talk instead about the card slot. This second slot in the Z8, which is an SD slot, is actually creating a bottleneck in the performance of the camera. I noticed that with the Nikon D850. My workaround was just to leave that goddamn SD slot empty. It's a shame I paid for it but could not even use it. But yeah, well, that's the way it is. So in my opinion, if you want to upgrade to the Z8, and if you could afford it, I would say just get the camera. Do not listen to those skepticisms around the net, and I think you will not be disappointed with the Z8. For me, I cannot afford to own the Z8 and the Z9 at the same time, and because I use big heavy lens most of the time, I actually like the size and the weight of the Z9, so I think I will then stay with my Z9. That's it for this video. I hope it clarified then this myth or skepticism on the small battery in the Z8. And until next time then, bye.